So we read How College Works by, I forget their names, Daniel Chambliss and Christopher Takish. And what we're going to do to start is just a general overview of the 8 chapters of the book to give you an idea of what they talked about, because it is kind of a unique situation. So the authors, their quest was to find ways to improve college without spending more money, and offer a practical solution that could be applicable to almost any institution. That was their end goal. And what they knew they needed to do was have a basic understanding of how college works. So get to the basics of how students live their life and how they are successful in college. So they created and implemented a longitudinal, multi-method, comprehensive effort to figure out what college students get from a residential college experience and then how to improve it. They created a study that over the course of 10 years, they interviewed and worked with about 100 students from a college, Hamilton College in Clinton, New York. It's a population of about 1,800 students. It's a small liberal arts school. It's undergraduate only. It's very selective. They have a quote-unquote well-paid faculty. And because it's so small, the faculty-to-student ratio, or student-to-faculty ratio, is 9:1. So their class sizes are very small. The authors have a particular fancy to the college. One of them is a faculty member, and the other one is an alumni. They say that their students are not typical. They're not the top-tier academic students, but they're certainly very close. About a fifth of their students would be considered multicultural, and they used a grant from the Andrew Mellon Foundation to fund this study. And what they found, what it boiled down to, was student success depended on who meets whom and when. And if it happens early, students will stay. So they broke it down into several different steps, I guess, to student retention and graduation. And in the first chapter, they talked about entering college, entering that first year, and the transition and how to assimilate into the social scene of a college. Because they decided that was what they found through the study was that was the most important element. And so the main focus was, how do they make friends? How do first-year students make friends? And in the first chapter, they went through several areas like Greek life, the residence halls, the dining facilities, athletics, kind of extracurriculars. They explored all these different areas where students meet other students and find common interests, to talk about how those friendships are made. And at the end of chapter 1, they said if a student can enter college successfully, they will stay there. And if they can't, then that's where you see students who want to transfer.
Okay, so one thing that the book talked about was class sizes. So typically, whenever people talk about class sizes, they say that the smaller the class size, the better. Why? Because it leads to more engagement and more opportunity. What the authors said was a little bit different. They actually said that small class sizes could be bad. And the thing is, the reason for this has to do with just the arithmetic. Whenever, let's say, for example, we have a sociology class of, let's say, 50 students, okay? And you want to make that class, you want to make that class smaller, so more students learn. By making that class smaller, what you're doing is you're making another class bigger. And then when you do that at a university level, let's say you have these 10 classes that were originally 40, 50 students, you make them smaller. Yes, that's okay, because now these students have more opportunity to take small classes. But at the end of it, what's really going on is that you're making other classes larger. And by making other classes larger, there are more students that are taking larger classes and less students are taking smaller classes. And what it was also saying that class size isn't necessarily the best way to look at it. What's more important is a professor. And they used several classes. One was Richard Feynman. He's a very famous physicist from the 60s. And his class sizes got pretty big, 200, 300 students, and the students were engaged. They were into the material. And one reason was because Richard Feynman was he was just a brilliant and just a great professor. So whenever deans and administrators are trying to choose classes or, structure their classes, they should consider are the most important thing is just the quality of the professor, and also being strategic in the way you structure everything. But that was one part of it, just the arithmetic of, I guess, engagement. And another section was called choosing. And this was interesting too because when college students enter college, this is like the freest time of their lives, right? Like this is where they actually get to make choices. And they spoke a lot about choosing courses. And when you talk to advisors, they say that a student has to explore so they know what they want to do. They have to take this biology class to see if they like biology, the sociology class to see if they like sociology. But what happens is that there are freshmen are typically the last students to go. So seniors choose classes, juniors choose classes, sophomores choose classes. And by the time a lot of these freshmen get in, a lot of the classes that they were interested in are taken. So what is really happening is that they're being pigeonholed, or I guess bottlenecked into specific classes that they may or may not be interested in. And that's not beneficial because a lot of these, if little things like these keep happening, what ends up happening is that come like sophomore, junior year, they're forced into specific majors because their opportunities to, I guess, choose were very limited. And I think, yeah, that's really all for these two sections of the book.
So then the authors go into what they termed as belonging, and that is the feelings that students get when they are members of the community of the campus. All students really kind of want to belong and have that sort of membership. I think that's what institutions sell, like become a whatever. For me, it was become a beaver, because we were the beavers. Yeah, it's a great mascot. It was very interesting though because they kind of broke it down into kind of these dynamics that institutions manipulate at times. There are 4 basic dynamics of belonging, and that is physical proximity, and so students have to be around each other to really kind of connect and belong and get that feeling. A shared focus of attention, so that means that they're all there for the same reason and all focused on the same thing. Ritualized common activities, which is they used cheering at football games. It's also like complaining about classes. Oh my gosh, this professor is so tough. That kind of bonds students as well. And then exclusivity. So when you join a group like Greek life or athletic teams, that creates an exclusive group, and that kind of helps with the feeling of belonging too. If you are a member of an exclusive group, you feel like you belong a little bit better. And so they kind of talked about how institutions can kind of manipulate those. They used 2 examples of football and dorms. So dorms, they pack students in, they live with each other. Those roles are not separated anymore. They see each other in the bathroom, they see each other at dinner, they see each other sleeping if you walk in and really taking a nap. You kind of bond in different ways. And then the football example was interesting just because football players have a very unique atmosphere, and they kind of branch out to different groups as well and can affect other students on campus. There's actually a diagram in the book that shows kind of how these students network. It looks like this. It's very fascinating. So there's core groups and there's peripheral groups, and it kind of shows where students can go. And those networks are very beneficial to students as well, because when students get too exclusive, too involved in one group, they don't branch out, and it's actually a negative as well. And then the next section was about learning. Specifically, students learn how to write and how to speak and critical thinking as well, which are the big 3 I think that most people want students to get out of. This is when they also analyzed writing samples from freshman year to senior year to kind of see if students improved over time. Speaking was actually interesting because that's the one thing that students recognized that they were very afraid of, but they realized that it's important, and then they wanted to learn. It's the only time students recognized that they needed to learn it. And then the book also broke down the different 2 different unique situations. So study abroad is one where students learn a lot. I think one was quoted saying that they learned, they grew up 6 years in 6 months. So they learned so much life skills in that short amount of time. And then for science, it's a super interesting discipline because that's a self-limiting kind of study. How many times have you heard someone say, well, I'm just not a science person? And so they really kind of limit their options there. And then I think that science, from my experience, they kind of develop that culture of exclusivity as well. Like, we are better than other people. And I'm not saying that's across the board, that was just my experience. And then at the end of this chapter, they kind of wrap it all up with why students learn, so what causes this learning. And their main thing was that students learn best from teachers who care. So they may not be the most knowledgeable, but they care about the topic, they care about their students.
So the part that I'm talking about is they kind of debate the book throughout the progression, so starting as freshmen, working through, so finishing senior year, and they basically boil it down to, the quote literally says that senior year is a time of pride and fear, pride at having surmounted the challenges and learned so much, and the fear of the approaching end of its phase of one's life and being forced, unless graduate school intervenes, to finally face the real world with a shocking shortage of safety nets. So it talks about how all this learning students have done is basically in a low-risk environment. If you try something out and fail at it, it's not really the end of your career. It's probably not even the end of your major or your course. It's really a safety net for them to decide what they're interested in, and seniors are recognizing that that's changing. They talk about how seniors often acknowledge that they think the campus has changed or the culture has changed, but truly it's the same and it's them who's grown up. So when they say things are more boring or the school isn't as social, it's honestly their viewpoints and their kind of where they're at in their lives that has changed. And it talks about how the most beneficial learning all of them recognized wasn't necessarily formal learning. It was the practicing of public speaking in organizations or classes without being told that was the point. And then the last chapter of the book boils down to what they kind of learned throughout the study, and they go through a few major assumptions or major findings. And that is, some of the key ones are that students face a chronological sequence of events, of challenges in college. So there's kind of a sequence we're all going to go through. It's picking the major, it's finding the friends. Relationships are central to successful college experience. They found that students will pick majors based on professors they liked. So it might be something they're not interested in all, but the professor was a mentor, so they majored in it. And that they'll follow readily available pathways. So things that are kind of already laid out for them are more likely to be found than students kind of going off the path. And then belonging to larger groups and to the college itself motivates students. So while they do have these organizations, the book talks a lot about them also needing that larger campus culture and to feel like they belong in more than just one small setting. So there's kind of a lot of different aspects to it for sure.
So if you guys could just talk about what you thought the strengths and weaknesses were of this book.
I think one of the biggest weaknesses was just, the institution is in New York. It's a small institution, I think like 1,800 students. And then these were already very high achieving students, and the school was getting very high results. I think like a 95% retention rate. And was it like 80? Their graduation rate was in the 80s. So a lot of what was going on, I think, it's like a good model, but it's not applicable to a lot of other schools, because a lot of the students that are being served by the institution in this book are almost already predisposed to be retained and to be graduating. They come in already knowing how to read and write. They come in not having to take like the lower level math classes. And they also, like, financially, I think 50% of the students were receiving financial aid, some sort of financial aid. So the financial, like, components that some students at more urban schools may face, these students probably don't. But that was just the biggest one. It's a small, private, liberal arts college with a very high achieving population, a very privileged population. That's the sense that I got from reading the book. I think that's its biggest weakness.
Yeah, they mentioned some of the students came from prep schools. I don't know how many, but that these students were already prepared to live on their own. They didn't have a lot of those challenges because they've already done it. So it's just another thing for them.
Some of the strengths were too that it broke it down into simple suggestions that they think are applicable to everybody, and they hope. So it was things like display your best teachers or use space to help people meet. So they talked specifically about don't let freshmen live in apartment-style residence halls. Like put them in the community-style dorms so they are interacting with people and meeting them, being forced to socially engage, because ultimately the book boil down to make friends or done.
We did agree that the study was very limited, but the results echo a lot of what I've been reading in other literature, which is that the social part of college is infinitely more important than the academic part when it comes to retaining and persistence to graduation. That the friends, the connectedness to campus, that's what's going to keep students on your campus. So I think we talked last night, like it would be interesting to see a similar study done at an HBCU, at a large Midwestern college or research university somewhere on the West Coast, just to see what kind of results they got in comparison to this one, since this is East Coast small liberal arts school.
Are we at 15
Yeah,
minutes?
sorry.
Well, let's give this group a round. Really appreciated that overview, followed by some strengths and weaknesses. That was awesome. So let's see what questions we have from the group.
So you mentioned that, it's all about who you be, right? The social part is so much more important than the academic part at times. I mean, obviously academic integration is really important, but social integration keeps students there. So how do we influence that? As student affairs professionals, were there recommendations given in the book in influencing students meeting positive people that will allow them to be retained? Because you can meet somebody who's negative, who convinces you to drop out or convinces you to go somewhere else. So how do we maximize the positivity to ensure that students are retained?
One of the suggestions they gave was help motivated students find each other. So it talked about there's always going to be those Greek letter organizations or those athletic organizations, but this talked about even inviting a group of bright freshman students for dinner at a leadership's house, at the president's house, hosting those opportunities for students to truly engage with each other and giving them kind of that support that as a freshman, someone's recognizing that they are already doing something correctly. Because if you get invited to the president's house for a dinner, which again, maybe not applicable to 30, 40,000 population schools, but for them, that was something that they really suggested, and making sure to give them those opportunities to kind of link in to other high achieving students.
I think too, one of the examples that I talked about, a student who kind of like a red flag, like they're probably going to transfer, was a student who her family, she was like far away from home, her boyfriend was back home, she wasn't meeting anyone, and I think as student affairs professionals, you get to know your students, and if they are like, hey, I have a friend who seems really unhappy, figuring out how to help them reach out to that person to bring that person back into an organization or a sorority or fraternity, try and help them, give them ways to help their friend get involved.
It's also important to understand the structure of, organizations. So like, let's say you have this huge organization, which from the outside looks like a great opportunity for people to get engaged and involved, but when you start digging into that organization, there might be more like cliques within organizations, and those students only, like, yes, they're part of this huge organization, and it looks like they're meeting people, but they're actually only engaging with the students that are like them within that organization. So there was one school in there in particular that noticed this with a very large Greek org, and they actually did away with the Greek org, and then they found out that a lot of the students were now being engaged, or the engagement at that school went from being like very central to non-central, so you saw student engagement everywhere instead of just in here where a lot of them were being pigeonholed. So I think just knowing the orgs and how the students are networking within the orgs and outside of the orgs.
So y'all talked about the student-to-teacher ratio and how that can affect student retention. But what about the administrator, like the counselor-to-student ratio? Because I think in a lot of institutions, you might have one counselor for 100 students. Did they talk anything about that? And if they didn't, what are some suggestions that you think would be good?
When you say counselor, do you mean like
Advisor.
an academic advisor?
Yeah.
I don't think they didn't mention how many academic advisors per student. But I would say, having spent a semester in the academic advising office with first-year students, maximize that time with them. You have about 30 minutes, so it's really important right away to figure out how they're feeling, how they're doing, what they're involved in, how their classes are going, and like establish that rapport right away, so that if there is trouble, you can help address it and help them figure it out. But I would say probably with a 9-to-1 student to faculty ratio, then their workloads are probably pretty small.
I think it would boil down to almost a similar thing with like the professor, that it doesn't necessarily matter the ratio as to the skill or dedication of, say, the academic advisor in that point. Because what they're saying is these great professors, it doesn't matter how large the class is, the students are involved and engaged. So if you've got these amazing academic advisors that can do all of this in 30 minutes, they can see more students and it wouldn't matter, but it's like making sure to only hire and recruit those that can succeed in that, and to continuously kind of review and make sure that they are succeeding.
And one thing that I found very interesting is that they actually said that an academic advisor is nowhere near as influential as their peers and as professors. And that makes sense, because think about when you were a freshman, how many times did you actually select that advisor? Maybe once or twice a year. So like, yes, it's important to hire very talented academic advisors, but the influence that they have is not as crucial and is not as important as other people within the university. So
I think they're good conveyors of information, though, like for your plans, that sort of thing. Help make decisions.
I think structuring the university, it's like when I talked about the arithmetic of engagement, making sure that there is opportunity within like enough courses, big courses, enough small courses, very talented professors. So when students start signing up for classes, they have an opportunity to, I guess, choose what they want to do instead of being pigeonholed into certain courses.
Did you like the book?
I liked it.
Really? I thought it was reminded me a lot of I went to a small liberal art school in Iowa, and some of the things that they spoke on I thought was very relevant. I've experienced the exact same thing.
I thought the focus on like personal relationships was interesting, because I think especially in like student affairs field, a lot of people went into this field because of someone they met, not necessarily a professor or a faculty member, but generally someone outside of that realm, whether it be another student that's like, oh, you're really involved, or someone in that field. So kind of the focus on following paths that are set up, so following someone that you looked up to or connected with was kind of salient in the story.
I thought the chapter on the arithmetic of engagement was really interesting, because having spent time in the classroom, I would be like, oh yeah, small classes. But what Jonathan made me think about last night when we were talking about this was, what is it doing to your other classes? So I'm still evaluating what it's making me think, but I do think there is value in a small class size. So
I agree. And then you could also say, well, just make more of those small classes. So like, let's say you have, make 4 sociology classes of 20 students instead of a big one of like 100. But then what about costs? Like, can you afford 4 professors? So that's, it's arithmetic of engagement gets tricky.
Brian, did you have a hand up?
Oh yeah, well I was just wondering if they had any suggestions. Like it was talking about how normally seniors register first, and like most schools do that so that they're staying on track to graduate. But I also understand like freshmen don't always get the classes that they should be in, so I didn't know if it had any recommendations for that particularly.
I don't think they have any recommendations for that specifically. I think what was interesting was when they talked about the academic advising kind of thing. They said that a lot of times students come to their advisors just with these schedules, and they say, oh, this is what I want to take, and the advisor's like, okay. They don't really discuss with the student at all. Like the student may pick, that's why I think the choosing chapter was so interesting, because it's like, okay, these freshmen may be making decisions for the first time in their life, and they're just picking willy-nilly, like whatever the heck they want. No one's like actually asking them, well, do you actually want to take this, and what's your goal eventually?
Does this school not have a core curriculum? Because I'm confused on how freshmen are not getting to the majors. If for your first 2 years you're supposed to be working on your core curriculum or taking some courses within the major. And so I'm wondering, is it a school thing? Because I know at SIUE, I didn't have that problem where like it was I took the core curriculum and then I applied to get my major.
I think Yeah, the issue that they kind of faced is like with students with those core classes, you're also generally sprinkling one or two major classes, and people being kind of pigeonholed into those quickly because these ones are like filled up, or if you are running out of gen eds, because a lot of these students came from prep schools, it'd be safe to assume that like they're all starting at the same level. There's not going to be people taking remedial classes, so everyone's enrolling at once. So
imagine this: you have your 1 through 3 pick in the classes that you want, and then you register really, really late. Once it's time to register, those 1 through 3 are gone, and now you're forced to take classes that you're not interested in. And if that continually keeps happening, you can start getting pigeonholed. But yeah, it's yeah. Does that kind of make sense?
Just confused on how it's not correlating back to the major, but that's fine. It's actually looking